Wasn't that fun? All right, so Raj Patel, you're standing by, and we are looking forward to tagging you in and hearing more about everything you got to offer. Not just your book, but you got a lot of knowledge in there to share.
Well, I don't know if I do, but I'm definitely a dirty girl. If I figure that yes, I'm very excited about the Ag Ventures and identifying exactly who I'm going to be. Yeah, dirty girl from Gasping. Yeah, but I mean, it's hard to tell without having a deeper look at their personalities, but just surface level.
Well, it's good that you can find the right one to connect with.
Yeah, sometimes you don't see yourselves in superheroes, a person of color, and but dirty girl, I there's a twinkle in her eye that says,
yeah. Yes, I agree. I married her. All right, so why don't you tell us about your book and the projects you got going?
Well, should I do the talk thing? Should I just get into it?
Get into it. We're here for you.
I'm going to get into it. Should I get into it? Yeah.
Yeah, man.
Give me take to the bridge.
I'm going to take the bridge.
Yeah.
James Brown.
Well, first of all, what can I say? I want to first thank you so much for the invitation to be here and the chance to see amazing people like Karen Washington. My goodness, we are not worthy. I'm talking to you now from occupied Texas. This used to be Come Crudo and Tonkawa territory and then the southern tip of the Comanche Empire. But now it's Austin, Texas. And of course, I understand that there's a fairly severe weather event about to breaking right now over New Jersey. And I'm sure our politicians here are responding with their sort of customary schadenfreude when anything bad happens to the coasts. I'm sure that they would advise you to book a trip to Cancun. I believe the Ritz-Carlton in Cancun is available for anyone with enough miles and money to make it down there, because obviously that's how our politicians here respond to any severe weather event or the threat of cold. But in the discussion that I've prepared, essentially what I want to do is say that not everything from Texas is bad, even though quite a lot of it is. I mean, Texas, the state that fought for slavery twice, and we're not actually allowed to say that. I was just looking at the rubbish that they make my daughter learn at school, and in it, these white Texans are fighting for their rights. They're very scared that the Mexicans are going to come and take their rights away, but never is it mentioned that right is the right to enslave other people. So, it's important to treat Texas with the skepticism that it deserves. But it's also important to remember that if we're thinking about a transformative food system, not everything from here has been or will be bad. So with that sort of caveat, and with my prayers for everyone in New Jersey who's battling the weather at the moment, maybe let me just dive into this idea of the opposite of an anti-inflammatory diet. Now, look, maybe I'll just I'll hide myself and just remind you that inflammation is the body's immune response to danger or the threat of danger. Now, the thing about that is that in general, immunity and inflammation is a good thing. You can cut your finger while you're out farming. What you need is your body to just marshal itself so that whatever's coming into your body is met, and that you don't have to sort of worry or suffer. And ultimately, if you cut your finger while you're out digging around, ultimately your body will repair itself, and the inflammation, the swelling, the heat, the bleeding, all of that'll stop. And so inflammation is a temporary part of healing. It's a good thing. The problem is that the way that we've constructed our world, and in particular our food system, things are such that there is a rampant rise in the number of inflammatory diseases. Inflammatory diseases aren't just things like multiple sclerosis or Crohn's disease or type 1 diabetes or asthma. They are now pretty much everything that is a sort of major chronic disease, has an inflammatory inflammatory component, as we're understanding. So everything from type 2 diabetes to heart disease, to certain kinds of cancers, to Alzheimer's, to, of course, the worst manifestations of COVID are all marked by increased inflammation. And so people are saying, well, why is all this going through the roof? What's bad about the world now that our bodies seem to be responding with this sort of ultimate kind of chronic fighting posture that's driving up a great deal of disease? Well, some people have said, well, our food system has a fair amount to do with that, and to some extent, that's right. We've got information about how the standard American diet is bad for inflammation. Now, I'm going to bombard you with science. If you want all the sort of nuts and bolts, if you want to look all this stuff up, y'all have the presentation. You can find more about this in the book Inflamed. But suffice to say that if you want to nerd out, you can. But the sort of bottom line here is that there are certain kinds of diets that are rich in fiber and biodiversity that generally help our guts to thrive. And then there are the standard American diet, particularly the one that's low in fiber. And so fiber doesn't necessarily nourish us, but it helps the things that live in us to survive. Diets that are low in fiber tend to generate inflammation. So if we don't have in our diets the stuff that feeds the other beings in our microbiome, in our guts, then it turns out that if we don't care for our guts in the way that we're learning to care for our soil, that we can have higher levels of inflammation. And so you might think, all right, fine. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to eat a ton of fiber. Like every meal is going to be metamucil and then some kale. Problem there is that even if we were to treat our diet, the sources of inflammation that even come from our food system aren't just about what we eat. So, if we look, for example, at what glyphosate does, there was a study in 2014 that observed that actually just having glyphosate enter your airways can cause inflammation. So the toxic soup that is our modern world, that's absolutely bound to our food system, causes inflammation, and you don't even have to eat the bad shit in order to suffer the consequences. Now, there's some good news here, which is that the creatures that live inside our guts are, it's possible to observe that there are places in the world where things in our guts haven't been killed by the modern food system. Now, what this slide shows, and maybe there's too much information here, so I'm going to turn it off, otherwise you'll get distracted. But the idea here is, look, here we are living in the global north, and particularly for those of us who live in cities, our exposure to the web of life has been so denuded and so contaminated and so strafed with pesticides that a lot of the things in our guts are dead. So we've lost vast numbers of species inside us, and they're gone for good because of the ways that we live with a very sort of sterilized world around us. But not everyone lives that way. If you look at Yanomami communities, for example, in southern Brazil, northern Brazil, and you can see where in Brazil they are. It's around about here, at the border of Venezuela. But there you see an incredible range of biodiversity in the gut. And if you want to nerd out, then the sort of phyla that are overrepresented in us in America are Bacteroides, and in the phylum that's predominant in indigenous communities in northern Brazil and southern Venezuela are Firmicutes. Good, it's just fun to say Firmicutes. I'm going to say it again. But what's important about that is that when you have more biodiversity in your guts, you have lower levels of inflammation. So let me say that again. When we have more of a great variety of things in our guts, that's associated with lower levels of inflammatory disease. And that's important because there have been studies that have done the unthinkable. What's happened is that that there have been anthropologists who've gone and taken Yanomami poop and run off with it to the global north, stuck it into a pill, and then administered it to people who have chronic inflammatory diseases, but particularly gastrointestinal ones, things like C. diff, for example. And people who've been treated with this biodiverse poop from other people have actually have done very well, and their levels of inflammation in their guts have gone down when they've been given these these wild and these biodiverse kinds of bacteria that come from the poop of indigenous people. And so brave publications like the New York Times is asking, you're missing microbes, but is rewilding the way to get them back? Is the way to fight inflammation to steal indigenous poop? Now, if you think the answer is no, I commend you, because if you think, yes, what we need to do is just raid stuff from indigenous people in the Americas, then you would be repeating the kinds of pattern that got us into this mess in the first place. The first thief from indigenous people, rather famously, was Christopher Columbus, who in 1492 in his diary, when he first sees the New World, he says, look, I can never tire my eyes in looking at such lovely vegetation, so different from ours. I believe that there are many herbs and many trees that are worth much in Europe for dyes and for medicine, but I do not know them, and this causes me great sorrow. So that, I think, is just warning light that there are things that indigenous knowledge and indigenous wisdom has preserved, and sadly, the way that the medical industry and the way the food industry would like to think of them is as supplements that can be stolen and sold at vast profit in order to treat the very diseases that the food system has caused. So we're living in a world of chronic inflammation, and the food system would rather sell us the shit of indigenous people, and the medical industry would do that too, rather than address some of the deeper issues which cause inflammation and inflammatory disease. So let's remind ourselves again, what is inflammation again? Well, inflammation is the body's immune response to danger or the threat of danger. That's very important, because your body is geared, is wired to anticipate threat. And that means that if you're able to see threats coming, your body settles into a chronic inflammatory state that's associated with all the diseases that I spoke of before. Again, asthma, diabetes, certain kinds of cancer, a range of other things. And you're more likely to have those things if your body's ready for a fight. So what is it that gets your body ready for a fight? Well, if you live as a member of the working class in an incredibly unequal and exploitative society, then one of the things that drives chronic inflammation is poverty. There's a range of studies that observe that poverty is much higher. Poverty is deeply associated with markers for inflammation, C-reactive protein, and those markers are again compounded not just by poverty but by race. We've got data here, and again, the references are elsewhere. Don't worry so much about this, but just understand that what I'm showing you is that even if you control for income and a range of other things, and you can see here plotted along an axis of education, that it doesn't matter. You still see disparities between non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic Black, and Mexican American communities around levels of inflammation, even when you control for a range of other factors. So race and class matter when it comes to to thinking about inflammation. Of course, gender matters as well, and we can talk about that later on. Actually, let me hold off here, because if we're interested in understanding what drives inflammation, and we're thinking systemically about the food system, then it's true. Diet has something to do with it, but actually much more important is the problem of the food system itself. The food system is an engine for exploitation. These inflammatory diseases are not accidents. They're not bugs in the food system. They're features for the working class. 7 out of the 10 worst paying jobs in America are in the food system. And if you've been worrying why the ruling class has been so excited to get everyone back to work, it's because their profits don't work when workers are not being exploited. If we're able to look after ourselves at home, if we're able to afford through not abundant unemployment, but just enough to survive, unemployment benefits that we can stay safe and look after our families, then that's what we'll do. And then the food system grinds to a halt. But if these 7 out of 10 worst paying jobs in America are in the food system, and the food system is then unleashed, then you will have cheap food available, but you will also have workers who are subject to chronic inflammation. Let me give you an example of how this works. If you are, for example, worried about being able to make rent and being able to pay for something like insulin and being able to put food on the table for your family at the end of the month, and your SNAP entitlements have run out, because for most working families, SNAP runs out about halfway through the month, again, by design, then you may take a payday loan. Payday loans, you're borrowing $300, you're paying back 800, so APR around about 400%, and that's absolutely associated with higher levels of C-reactive protein. In other words, if by dint of being a member of the working class in America, your politicians have sent you out to suffer not just directly in things like meat processing plants, which were the incubators for COVID early on, but just in a common or garden working class job in America, and it never pays enough, you are chronically stressed about being evicted and about being, making sure that your kids have enough food, and about treating the diseases that you've gotten from chronic inflammation. And payday loans are a feature of modern capitalism in America. And we know that if we abolished payday loans, rates of inflammation would go down, and rates of the accompanying symptoms of high levels of inflammation would go down as well. So what that means is that in states that have payday loan regulations, you see lower levels of suicide, of drug abuse, and of alcohol abuse. And we know that in America, if we abolished payday loans as a way of treating inflammatory disease, then we would see suicide rates drop by 8.9% and drug overdose rates drop by 4.6%. So this is a way of treating inflammatory disease, which we understand is manifest through things like our diet, but is caused by a food system that exploits us incredibly, and exploits particularly the working class. So the way I'm heading here is by just saying, look, systemic problems need systemic solutions. And the good news is that in the United States, we've got a history of being able to understand these systemic problems and come up with systemic solutions. One of my favorite bits of Americana is this. This is from 1889. And this itself was, it's a cartoon that has in its top left an example of workers, prostrating themselves in front of barons. And now, in 1889, you see workers giving their wages and their taxes to the ruling class. And on the right, you see people wearing these sort of bearded fat white guys wearing banners that say trust, and they're wielding the swords of legislation, and they march under the banner of war, tariff, and monopoly. So in 1889, folk were like, hey, you know what? We've been here before. We've seen how monopoly power works to exploit workers. We see how our jobs are essentially, the playthings of the rich, and we see how they wield legislation against us because their monopolies are so powerful that they're able to basically buy the government. And so we give them our wages and our interest and our loans, and we suffer and we prostrate just like medieval serfs did. But, in America, plus ça change. And so here we are in, again, an era of monopoly. This was fairly recent data looking at how concentrated our food system is. And you can see, the top 4 companies are essentially running the show. You pick a sector, any sector, there you are. You've got your large-scale producers essentially telling us how it's going to be. But just as in 1889, and just as farmers' movements and workers' movements in the past have come up with ideas for breaking power, there are models that we can reach back to learn from. And I mean, particularly now we're hearing a great deal about the sort of the Great Resignation, and we're hearing a great deal about strike activity. And we're hearing about sort of unionizing successes, in New York, for example. We're seeing sort of rays of light when it comes to farm worker organizing. And I just want to point out that there's a history of that, and there's a history of that even here in Texas. In fact, one of the early moments of hope and celebration in Texas came in 1883 with the Great Cowboy Strike. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands for folk who knew that there was such a thing, because I don't want to embarrass anyone. The fact is, this is a bit of sort of labor history that is often forgotten, in part because of the myth of the cowboy as being the white dude who's so utterly conservative that that he's there to follow essentially in the sort of hoof prints of John Wayne. But more importantly, the idea of the cowboy as being someone who is a sort of self-made man of the kind where worker consciousness would never occur to him. And yet here we are in 1883, where you have workers, and it's a sort of multiracial coalition of workers in 1883 who bandied together and figured out when their bosses would be most likely to capitulate, and just as the herds are about to be delivered or need to be driven for delivery in Chicago, is when the cowboys go on strike. And what do they ask for? First of all, they say, well, we want $50 per month. So we want a good wage. But they just ask for that. They ask for things like good coffee. They want a good knife to play mumble peg with. I'm not sure what that game is, but I'm sure it's excellent. And I like the idea that as part of your unionizing demand, you're also asking for things that you need when you're not on the clock, but you're still far away from home. But also importantly here, they were doing a kind of wall-to-wall organizing drive here. They were saying, look, yes, the lucrative work may be the folk with the lassos out front, but we also care about the people who maintain the camp. And so we want equal wages for the cooks in the camp as for the lead riders. And that wall-to-wall understanding that we're all workers here and we're all driving the herd. And yes, there are some people with certain kinds of skills, but we all, we live or die together, is a kind of example of worker solidarity and organizing that I think is really important to recognize and learn from. And in 1883, there was some success that then was eroded away by a series of both local and geopolitical transformations. But strikes are really important when we think about how it is that we hold together and how we adopt systemic solutions to inflammation. And it is exciting right now that we find ourselves in moments, in a moment of heightened strike activity. Now, it's true that there's, our strikes at the moment don't really hold a candle to the stuff immediately after the war. But it's also important to remember that the stuff after the war doesn't really hold a candle to the stuff that happened before the war. Let me go back there. Here it is after the war. So 1947 is just on the left, and you see a sort of rise in strikes through the 1950s. But actually, that pales into insignificance compared to the stuff that happened after the First World War, that happened, in fact, during the pandemic, the flu pandemic of 1919-1920, incredible high levels of strike activity. It dies down in the early 1930s when everyone loses their job. But as soon as folk get their jobs back, strike activity goes up. And through the original New Deal, the New Deal wasn't a way to make strikes go away. The New Deal was an engine for increased strike activity. Here's work stoppages from 1930 to 1937. It only goes up until then, the First World War, Second World War puts an end to strike activity. But strikes were the ways that collectively America shaped its destiny, and through the New Deal shaped the ways that our food system looked. So whether it's things like the Agricultural Adjustment Act that then became the Farm Bill, or whether it's things like food stamps that now become the SNAP program, all of that, the seeds for that were laid through worker militancy when we were taking care of one another as a way of reducing our inflammation, as a way of caring for the economy as a system, rather than seeing workers as the sort of sacrificial tinder on the flames of the economy. And farmers played a part in that. Although farmers were sometimes bosses, they were nonetheless part of a movement that recognized that the real enemy was not farm workers, but was Wall Street. And so you see farmers here in 1935, part of a movement called the Farmers' Holiday in a march for social justice and equality. There are songs about having a farmer's holiday. A farmer's holiday we'll hold, and the Wall Street types can eat their, and we will eat our wheat and bread, and they will eat their gold. And the idea that farmers could hold a knife to the throat of city dwellers, and in particular to Wall Street, was something that was possible to feel in 1935. Now, I want to just sort of take a pause there and just recognize essentially what I'm saying is that there's, if we're interested in transforming the food system, then let's look to American history, and let's look to, in particular, to sort of labor struggles, and understand that when we're thinking about the kinds of food system that we find ourselves in today, one that generates inflammation, that depends on the exploitation of workers, that then result in inflamed bodies and disease that specifically affects workers, then we need a coordinated and systemic response. But I want to leave you with another set of ideas that are about, again, medicine and disease and immunity, and the idea of colonialism. I began by it. I mean, look, here I am on stolen land, a settler on that land, and I imagine y'all largely are as well. Now, that's something that requires us to take a relationship to it. And one way of thinking about that is to start looking at the language that's knit into the ways that we live and breathe, to understand that we are not only settlers, but colonists without even believing that we are. Let's have a look again at the idea of what inflammation is. Inflammation is the body's immune response to danger or the threat of danger. That word immune. Now, over the past couple of years, we've all become Wikipedia experts on the immune system. But the idea of immune is something that you won't find on Wikipedia, because it's actually a word that has origins in colonialism. When the Romans were busy colonizing the Mediterranean, they needed a word to describe the cities that they wanted to be part of the empire, but recognized that were never as good as Rome. And the words that they had for cities that were, for a city that was colonized, was that this was a free city, but it was immune. So a civita libera et immunis is a city that's free and immune. And what that immune there means, munera is the Latin word for duties. And to be immune is to not have the same duties as proper Romans do. So immune already has in it the idea of someone not quite like us. It has the idea of them and us built in. And we have this idea even in our sort of language when you're under the weather, you're sniffling, and your response, oh, I'm fighting something off. Because there's you and there's that thing over there, there's that foreign body that you're trying to fight off. And this idea of purity and external intruder is how it is that we metaphorically come to understand our bodies and our immune systems. But our immune systems aren't about foreigners. They're about sensing danger. And there are lots of things outside us that are not dangerous. In fact, that we need to survive. Exhibit A being precisely these biodiverse things in our guts that are helping us avoid inflammatory disease. They're not human. They are inside us, but they're not dirty foreigners. They are, in fact, part of what it is that allows us as humans to thrive, because humans aren't just one thing. We're billions of different creatures living together in what's called a holobiont. And so when we start talking about immunity as a colonial concept, we start saying, well, look, to be immune is to be good at policing the border between me and them. You're already starting to talk like a colonist. And there's a way around this. If we remember that solidarity is anti-inflammatory, well, let me explain what this means with an example. There are ways in which the boundaries of us and them have been drawn not for us, but by our oppressors. And there's a history in the South of organizing around rejecting the divisions of race, for example, and class that have been imposed on us by the bourgeoisie. And the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, for example, is a vital source of inspiration for us now, a militant organization in which farm workers were able to come together and recognize their common bonds of humanity in transcendence of what the prevailing political chatter said was the most important differences. And through study and through mutual aid and through organizing, we were able, in the South, there's this beautiful history of folk coming together and winning massive concessions and victories from the from the ruling class. And even here in Texas, we've got this fantastic history that, again, not enough people know about, of Emma Tenayuka. She was a militant, she was a communist activist through the 1930s. She ended up in jail a few times as a result of her organizing against the Immigration and Naturalization Service. So she was someone who was who recognized that the boundaries of American citizen and non-American citizen were entirely artificial when a lot of the workers, and particularly the women workers in the pecan industry in San Antonio, were not American citizens, but were Mexican-American women. She herself was Mexican-American, indigenous, and she was imbued with a sense of understanding that there was and always needed to be porous ideas of identity and boundary, because the history of her many peoples were precisely about the idea of people moving around freely and with dignity. And she herself was part of a really important strike in 1938. The pecan shellers strike started off as being a strike for wages, but in her words, what started as a strike, as a movement for equal wages, turned into a mass movement against starvation, for civil rights, and for the minimum wage. And she was able to do that because she organized and didn't have this idea of organizing only for Americans or organizing only for these people in this particular site. She was organizing for all oppressed people everywhere through San Antonio. And it's if you don't know enough about that, what can I say? Read up, Google Emma Tenayuka. There's a lot to learn there. So, the final thing that I want to suggest is that this kind of intentional mobilizing across boundaries of race, and this kind of intentional mobilizing where you have farmers and farm workers, and you have movements of the poor, you have movements of the hungry, all coming together. That's not some sort of faraway fantasy. You don't even have to go as far back as the New Deal to see an example of it. Again, here in Texas, we've got leaders in that field. Here you've got Reverend Jesse Jackson, Willie Nelson, Jim Hightower, who, so some of you may know, was Texas's Agriculture Commissioner, and Ralph Page, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, organizing together. And if we are to survive the situation that we find ourselves in, then the lessons of the Rainbow Coalition of the 1980s are ones that we need to learn moving into 2022, but in particular for 2024 and the election. Because it's only through building these kinds of radical working class movements that are able to see in ways that the current Democratic Party certainly doesn't, and that are able to demand the kinds of radical transformation of not just of agriculture and the food system, but of the planet, that a red, black, and green New Deal would demand. Without that, I'm afraid we are looking at a future in which our bodies, our communities, and our planet remain inflamed. But there are ways out of this, and through the organizing of of movements, particularly of working class movements, we can imagine a world that puts an end to inflammation, and that takes seriously the idea that we began with, that actually, we get together, we cook, we eat, and we imagine a different future. And that idea, in the words of C.L.R. James, is that every cook can govern. And I'm looking forward to the era when every cook does. But for now, I've given you a lot there, and I would rather stop now and answer questions. So if I may, let's dive in.
Let's dive in. We got a few people had some great questions. We have a couple people standing by. But first, I want to let you know something. So during your talks, you had such wonderful ideas, things that I wasn't aware of, the cowboy strike. So now that might be one of my next films. But after, I'm going to have to hire you for this parody. We're going to do the NOFA-11 with Raj Clooney. Doesn't he he looks a little bit like, see, look at that.
Look at
see
that.
what I mean? So you'll be the boss character in our heist film where we take over the world and make them eat better.
I will do my very best. Yes, but I'm not going to do my Clooney.
No, you say it.
Yeah, don't let them know.
Say it, yeah.
So we actually we're trying to coax Tammy Sands. Are you available? You ready? You want to jump in with a question? And then Janine Cava, you would be next. We're inviting you in. So if you want just voice or camera, it's up to you. Or maybe they're shy. Maybe.
So I'll do voice. This is Tammy.
Perfect.
Hi. Thanks. It was awesome. And I am so delighted that, NOFA has invited the discussion about the connection with food and health, people in our societies, right, in our histories. During my education for law, I focused in environmental law and policy with food and agriculture. My thesis focused on modern day agricultural slavery. And in part of what you said, right, about this inflammatory process coming out in people due to, poverty levels, disparity, we'll just say that, right? What, in your snapshot opinion, in putting aside maybe the ability to strike because people may not have that ability, what would a solution look like for an inflamed individual in survival mode to access healthy foods?
That's a hard question because to some extent you're tying my hands behind my back. Without the possibility of striking, and do remember that the cowboy strike happened in the absence of a union, right? There was no union, there was no right to strike, they just did it. So that's important to recognize that you don't need a framework of law in order to enable folk taking action against their employers, and particularly in that cowboy situation, it's that they had their employers over a barrel. So either the herd got driven to Chicago or it didn't. Or Kansas City. And so there are maybe structural ways in which worker power manifests itself. But one of the things that I've seen through my comrades in La Via Campesina, the international peasant movement, emerging through this moment of COVID, is these rich networks of mutual aid. And those networks allow folk to be able to access biodiverse and healthy food through the kinds of local organic farming systems that we're here to celebrate and strengthen. But they happen in the absence of the state, in large part. And it's been very striking, whether it's been in Mexico or Peru or in other communities around the world where the state has really been sort of sitting on the outside, wondering what it should be doing. And meantime, communities of working class and poor people are like, for the love of Christ, people are hungry. And it's not just now that they're hungry, they've been hungry for ages. And so here we are with our community gardens. Here we are occupying land and growing food, for the sort of medium and long term. But in the meantime, here's us organizing and mobilizing to be able to raise money as a community and be able to buy food collectively and then redistribute it. These kinds of mutual aid actions are ones that have a history in the United States. And I'm heartened by the fact that often the law is observed in the breach. That there are people, who are perhaps not abiding by, labor law, who are not necessarily able to comply with some of the food industry sponsored biosafety regulations that really discriminate against small farmers to some extent. There are ways in which as communities help one another. I'm not sure whether that's a satisfying answer, but the kinds of response that strike me as the most durable are not at the individual level. So, while we can and we should, all of us, get our fingers dirty, as again, dirt girl, it's just, I'm there. The idea of just making sure that we have a rich microbiome under our fingernails and around us is really important. And insofar as we can grow and share food in our families and our communities, I'm doing that. We've all got friends who are, we're all doing that. But we do need the bigger infrastructure to make sure that we are organizing for and with folk who don't have the capacity to be able to access land, say, as they would like. And that means occupying land, that means redistributing food and reclaiming food and resources that may not have secure property rights on them or may involve a violation of property rights. But I'm okay with that. And the pandemic has suggested that, in fact, that kind of urgency can allow a violation of property rights for the working class in ways that may not necessarily guarantee your unblemished progress to the bar. But I think it's just important to recognize that sometimes you have to steal from the rich.
It's Raj bin Hood.
Raj bin Hood, come on. I'm sorry, that's a good one. But obviously, right. So we have a nice question that came up. What can we learn from other countries to transform our connection between food and inflammation?
What a great question. I do think that again, when one thinks of, let's start by recognizing first of all that the United States has within it well over 500 nations. And there are a lot of those nations that can teach us a thing or two about how it is that we need to think about food and colonialism and cosmology. Again, the reason that here we are largely as settlers on this stolen land, and we come with a cosmology that first of all makes us forget what it is to be a settler, and then makes us think that food is over here and medicine is over there, and makes us think that that there are yes, all right, human beings are living beings, but really maybe my dog is a sort of a being that I can give a name to and treat with a pronoun. But other than that, the rest of the web of life, I don't really care about the virome or fungi or whatever it is, except. Okay, was there a fungi dude in who were part of the ag?
Mycelium man.
Mycelium man, of course. Fungi fella. So mycelium man. The idea that there should be personhood for other living beings is really important. One of my, if in the coastal Salish people in what is now the Pacific Northwest, so it was now the Pacific Northwest of what's called the United States and Canada, you find things like treaties between, say the Muckleshoot people and the salmon people, a certain species of salmon. Now, what's interesting about that is not only that salmon are treated as people, but they are treated as people and as an independent nation to the extent that there are treaty rights in the same way that the Muckleshoot has treaty rights with the United States government. And those treaty rights are so important that that there are celebrations of the first salmon that allow and embrace the respawning of salmon, that allow the sort of transfer of sea nutrients all the way up the river to the sort of forests of the northwest. I mean, if you look at the sort of biomarkers of certain kinds of nutrients that are in the forests of the northwest, you'll find that some of their origins are from the Pacific Ocean. They've been brought there by salmon. And by having these treaties, you keep intact not only the sort of flows of nutrients, but also you have salmon, one of the most profoundly anti-inflammatory foods that exist for certainly for indigenous nations. And it's very interesting that exactly the same food, when farmed, has pro-inflammatory effects. That in fact, a farmed salmon has much less of the anti-inflammatory oils than the wild salmon. So what this suggests is that there are food ways that thrive not through even just saying identifying the one thing that seems to be good about these food ways, anti-inflammatory, like, oh, I love the salmon. Salmon's anti-inflammatory in this context. I'm going to farm it over here, and surely it's the same thing. No, you need to have the relationships to the web of life that come with the salmon, that love the salmon and recognize and mutually kind of are constituted by the salmon and one's own people. And so, one doesn't have to look overseas to find different nations, first of all. And again, I just get so fucking annoyed by the lies that my children have to do in school every day. And I believe that this is fairly universal. The children in America are told this is one nation under God. And that's a daily act of amnesia, because this is not one nation. This is a country of hundreds of nations, but only one of them seems to be important right now. Every day we must forget that we are settlers, and that's why our children are made to say this garbage at school. I was one of these kids who sat down for the national anthem, because when I was growing up, the Queen is sufficiently saved, but my standing up and singing for her doesn't necessarily increase her chances of saving. And frankly, I think regicide's a good idea. But enough of my childhood. So the idea, again, just to return to the question of what do we learn about inflammation from other countries, recognize, first of all, that this country is one of many nations, and then recognize that within these nations, there's understandings of how we knit together with the rest of the web of life that are profoundly different from our colonial mentality. And those relationships of care and recognition and of seeing are ones that are going to help us with our anti-inflammatory drive, but also help recognize and re-knit the world that our colonial mentality has torn apart and set on fire.
So just to jump in, because you had mentioned, there's medicine is here, food is here. Now both Scott's wife is an acupuncturist. My wife, AKA Dirty Girl, is the farmer. She actually she's a massage therapist, but has a degree in herbal medicine from the Pacific Northwest up at Bastyr University. And right outside, under our snow now, but under our feet, I love telling the kids, again, bringing it back to the kids, about plantain, not the yummy, delicious little banana bodies, but plantain leaf. Chew it up, make a poultice, put it on your hand, and it actually sucks away, whether it's a bee sting or a little piece of a thorn or something. And we've forgotten that there is medicine here in the forest, in the field, and I think now we're using herbs to help make the inflammation go down that we've caused by eating the harmful things. But the cycle, just reconnect to the cycle. And my wife and I are excited. We're gonna get your book. We're gonna check it out, and maybe that should be one of our next book club books here at NOFA, New Jersey. We'll talk more about that at another time. But anyhow,
yeah, the parallels between inflamed sense and inflamed attitudes and inflamed biology is just it just makes so much sense now that you've thrown it out there on the table and really brought it to the surface. We do have a pretty specific question from one of our guests, asking about Indian farmers and farm workers fresh from their victory over Modi's 3 corporate farm laws. Do you want to throw in on that if you have any?
Oh, I'm excited about that. First of all, because there's still so much to play for. So for those of you who weren't following this shame on you, because this is one of the largest, I mean, it's one of the largest social mobilizations in the history of human mobilizations around anything. But there was a time when there were 350 million people protesting this, and that what they were protesting was essentially the sort of corporate takeover of agriculture, specifically around 3 laws in India that would have made it easier for large corporations to take over farmers' rights, farmers' bargaining rights in northern India. So it was a fairly esoteric bit of legislation that was kind of targeting just the most industrial farmers in the north. But the bigger picture here is around farmers' rights to be able to have a basic income. And farmers are fighting for that. And there's another sort of fun subtext here, which is, look, the farmers in the north of India are heavily indebted. They've been sold on a package of industrial agriculture that's meant that they've drained the aquifers under their land. Their soil is now sort of essentially dust, and they depend on government subsidy to be able to survive. And there are epidemics of drug abuse and despair, kids emptying out of rural areas, and there's just, it looks like America. It looks like rural America in terms of the ways that government subsidy and certain visions of what industrial agriculture is good for has resulted in apocalypse for the environment and for farming communities. And so what's exciting about the mobilization is that there is the space here to imagine something better and different, and not just, oh, we need more subsidies, not the sort of Trumpian mode of let's keep things as they are, but pay farmers more out of money that we're just going to print, and that'll be the way in which we carry on business as usual. But actually a call for, what we need is a call for a transformation in food systems. India has the great advantage of having limits on land acquisition. So there are a couple of states that are increasing the land ceiling, as it's called, the amount of land that any one person can hold. But there's still, lots and lots of small farmers in India in a way that we just can't have in the United States, because it's possible now for America's largest landowner to be Bill Gates, because farmland as an asset, you can own as much of it as you care to. And in India, mercifully, small farms still prevail because you can't own more than a sort of certain limit of hectares. But the great vision here is that there is hope. The bad news again is that India still suffers from inflammation. Here's a country that's incredibly coal dependent, right? So the country is inflamed, the air is inflamed. When you go into cities, India's cities are the most polluted, far more polluted than China, which seems to have the bad rap here. But it has levels of pollution that are apocalyptic, that are like the wildfires in California or the smoke from fires that have reached Yaal from time to time. But that's a routine phenomenon when stubble in the field is burned because of certain kinds of regulations around the Green Revolution. So the bad news is that India's world is inflamed, its communities are inflamed, much like ours. You've got this sort of fascist right wing rising, and you've got Islamophobia, you've got a prime minister, head of state, who jumps on social media to fan the flames of his popularity and to drive social division. Again, it's just like America a year and a half ago, and all of that is there, and it's getting worse. But there are moments of hope, and the fact that so many million people were able to mobilize around it should give us pause about despair. There is everything to fight for, and millions of Indians are fighting for it.
Well, I think, does anybody else have, oh, yes, Janine, you do have a question. Sorry, I just called her out. Janine.
I really didn't before, but I do now. Thank you, Raj. It's been really stimulating and invigorating, and it's always nice to get the international perspective, and it's great to have a little morning, Saturday afternoon geek out session on the history of US labor organizing. That's always awesome. So my question is about whether or not there are any examples in the US or I guess elsewhere, but of worker-owned cooperatives in the agriculture or food system spaces in the US. And so it's great to know about the specifics, but then also whatever state that or city that may be happening in, like what are the structural changes that maybe had to be in place in order for that to be able to flourish?
Well, it's a great question. But one of my favorite examples comes from actually from South Africa, from shack dweller communities who've occupied land in a place called Ekahana in Durban. And they were taught about agroecological farming by the sort of heroes of land occupation agroecological farming, the MST from Brazil. So these activists militants from the MST, the Landless Rural Workers Movement in Brazil, came over to South Africa, and as part of their work, they helped set up this sort of collectively owned and run farm in Durban. But what had to happen was not so much sort of structures of ownership, because the land is actually sort of occupied, it's not owned. But what needed to precede that was a lot of social organizing. And that's what the MST is very good at, right? That when they start their collective farms, they spend 2 years working with people on the side of the road, building social relationships and working together in ways that help people realize that one of the great things about not having a boss is not having a boss. But one of the worst things about that means that you have to be the boss from time to time. And as anyone who's been in a cooperative knows, sometimes that's just weird because we haven't been taught how to do that. Our whole lives, we've been taught subservience and obedience. So we're well conditioned really through childhood of how to do what the teacher says. But we're really bad at being the teacher. And then giving up that role and stepping back and then stepping in and then stepping back. But in a cooperative, you know that you've got to do that, right? Sometimes you're the boss and sometimes you're just like part of the team doing the stuff. And figuring out what the boundaries are is the really hard work of collectivism. And there's no school for that. Those schools are limited. So that's the hard part. It's not impossible, but there are movements, even in the US, that are excited to be working on this. I know I'm running out of time, but I'm really excited by the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. UFCW is part of the union that organizes, what are they called? Slaughterhouse workers, what are the meat packers? What's been interesting is how meat packers, first of all, realized that they were the disposable people when it came to COVID, right? Here in Texas, the hotspots initially were old people's homes, prisons, and slaughterhouses, meatpacking sites. And so the UFCW workers are like, look, we need to be moving out of this job. We need a just transition away from this very carbon intensive, methane intensive, climate destructive work. And what we want is worker owned co-ops from farm to fork. We want worker owned co-ops in the field. We want worker owned co-ops in distribution, worker owned supermarkets, and worker ownership and cooperatives all along the way. And so keep an eye on what the UFCW is doing here, because their vision is, I think, very exciting when we're thinking about the Green New Deal, about a just transition. And I definitely keep an eye on the kinds of skills around cooperativism that they're looking to share.
Well, Raj, thank you so much. You were a pleasure. You're very entertaining, very charismatic, and you're very smart too. You were making it sound like you weren't sure you had smarts. You got smarts.
Why, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, well, no. Thanks for sharing them with us. Obviously, I'm designed to be an entertainer. But anyhow, so we're gonna say au revoir to Raj for now, and then we are going to take a little break. But when we come back, we're gonna have two wonderful plant-based chefs. Oh, they're already here. They're close by, but we gotta take a peek.
Tony,
You guys.
Tony, let's have everyone turn on their cameras and.
Oh, that was nice. Brady Bunch style.
I'm gonna put on my information after this.
Gallery view. Thank you, Raj.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah, we really have been really lucky having an awesome crew of speakers today. So thanks again to everybody, and COVID man over here.
It's just a little inflammation.
Fortunately,
It'll go down.
I've had my vaccine, so I'm not afraid. Anyway, so yeah, all right. So we're gonna take a quick 5-minute pee break. So Rich and Kate, hang close by, and we'll be back in a couple minutes.
Sounds great.
All right, thanks everybody.